is about democracy and democracy in decline. We begin with the premise that almost everyone claims to value democracy, to view democracy positively. And even the countries that are generally considered democratic, countries like China, Cuba, Iran, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, all of those countries claim to be democratic. Since about the 1970s, democracy has been a concept that has practically universal appeal. And yet, people hold very different views about what democracy is and why it matters, why they value it. So some people think that it is elections that matter about democracy, and that whatever result the elections produce is democratic. And other people are more focused on the balance of powers. A democracy is a system of government that divides power among different branches of government: the executive branch, which is the office of the president, the judicial branch, the court system, and Congress or parliament, so that no single branch is able to make every decision. So some people are more focused on the balance of power aspect of democracy. And others are focused on voice. A democracy is a government in which the citizens get to have their say. They can express their opinions, and there will be forums in which their opinions matter. Their preferences can make a difference in outcome. No single branch is able to make every decision. So some people are more focused on the balance of power aspect of democracy. And others are focused on voice. A democracy is a government in which the citizens get to have their say. They can express their opinions, and there will be forums in which their opinions matter. Their preferences can make a difference in outcomes. And for others, it's political equality. A democracy is a system where each person has one vote and where each vote counts equally. And other people still care more about rights. A democracy is a system that protects the rights of citizens. It's a system in which human beings have certain liberties that democratic governments are obliged to protect. So people value democracy, but many people have different views about what democracy is. And not only that, but many people are also unhappy with their own democratic governments. So in 2024, for example, 60% of the people in the UK were dissatisfied with the way democracy was working in their country. In the US, it was 68%. In Peru, it was 90%. And in Canada, it was 46%. In Canada, 46% of people in 2024 were dissatisfied with how their democracy was working. And the global median among all democratic countries is 54%. So more than half of all people who live in under democratic systems of government are dissatisfied with how their government is working. So they favor people favor democratic forms of government, but a majority of people who live in democratic countries don't think that their own democracy is working very well. And closely related to that is that there is declining trust in democracy and democratic institutions. So 78% of Americans say they don't trust their government. Across the OECD countries, 44% of the population has low trust or no trust in government. One political science study published in 2025 showed that between 1990 and 2019, so what's that, about 30 years, Trust in parliament declined 9% across democracies globally. And only about 17% of Canadians say they trust politicians, although 32% say that they trust the federal parliament. So it's politicians that they trust less than the actual institution of the parliament. And finally, democracies appear to be in decline as authoritarian leaders come to power and undermine or erode the norms or institutions of democracy. So this is often called democratic backsliding. And it's where countries that were once democratic either become less democratic or they become wholly undemocratic. So if we view government types along a spectrum, we would have democracy at one end and autocracy at the other. So an autocracy is a system of government in which it's a system in which government is controlled by one person or one party, and the exercise of political power becomes more arbitrary and more repressive. And the space for political participation in the process of government selection is heavily restricted, and opposition is either eliminated or limited in its scope. So this is the slide that you're seeing here is it's a global democracy index. And what you'll notice here is that democracy is not a binary kind of state. Democracy isn't either that something that you either have or you don't have. It exists along a spectrum where you can have more or less democracy, more or less self-government, rights and liberties, freedom of opposition, and so forth. So democratic decline is the weakening of democratic institutions such as the peaceful transition of power or free and fair elections or the violation of individual rights, especially freedom of expression. So what you see here is that some established democracies are becoming less democratic, and many countries that were democratic 10 or 20 years ago are now considered authoritarian or hybrid regimes. That's what this map is showing you. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on a few things. I'll offer a very brief history of democracy, how we got to where we are, and then we will focus on a definition of democracy, what democracy is and why we value it. So there's a debate about what there is to value about democracy, and I want you to understand that debate. And then in the third section, we will focus on why democracy is under threat and how democracies decline. And that's where we'll go over the reading, some of the reading that you did for today, on how democracies die. And then I will offer some examples from the first few months of the Trump administration that elaborate on or offer evidence of the ways in which democracies are undermined from within, from the government, from democratically elected governments themselves. So let's start with a brief history of democracy, which I imagine many of you are already familiar with. So democracy is a concept that first emerged in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens in the 5th century BCE. But there were other earlier forms of democratic practices as well among indigenous people including very close to here in the Iroquois Confederacy, right here in Canada, in southern Ontario. So historians generally identify, notwithstanding Indigenous experiments with democracy and systems of government, historians generally identify Athens as the birthplace of democracy because citizens participated directly in decision making. So Athenian so-called direct democracy was limited by citizenship status. So the Athenians excluded women and slaves and non-Athenian residents from decision-making forums. But Athenian citizens, men and property owners who were not slaves, gathered together in a central location, and they deliberated about government decisions. They deliberated about things like taxes and where to put sewage and whether or not to go to war and so on and so forth. And what's important about this period is that you have early experiments with democratic participation and thinkers like Pericles and Aristotle who are theorizing democracy. They're developing ideas like equality before the law and citizen participation. And then these ideas would later be the groundwork or the foundation for further development in the modern era. So modern democracy is distinct from Athenian democracy primarily through the innovation of representation. So in Athens, citizens literally gathered together to make decisions. They discussed the actual substance of what they were going to do. In representative democracy, on the other hand, people vote, and then their elected representatives deliberate and make decisions that presumably the voters would support. So here in this modern period, we have thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu and Rousseau building on earlier work to theorize the values and the principles and the institutions of democratic government. And then you also have events like the so-called Glorious Revolution in Britain and the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And these are all key historical moments in the 1600s, 1700s, in the implementation of these theories, where democracy actually gets put into practice. But still, as in Athens, voting rights were limited in these early experiments with democracy to men who were property owners. So those were the people who were allowed to vote. And women and people who didn't own property and indigenous people and others were excluded from voting. So in this modern period, democracy is generally believed to have advanced in three waves. And each wave is a historical period in which a number of countries become democratic. So the first wave was a long one in which countries that were, for the most part, monarchies became democracies. So what we're looking at here is this blue line at the bottom, the darker blue line at the bottom of this graph, which starts in 1849 and then moves very slowly and gradually up. And here I'm talking about countries like Britain, France, the US, and so on. So this is a long, slow wave of democracy. The first wave is long and slow, and it it reaches a high after World War I in 1923, when about 15% of the countries in the world are liberal or electoral democracies. And then you see a blip where it falls off again and reach a nadir, a low point in 1942 and 43 during World War II. And so then after World War II, you have the second wave of democracy. And that happens, so the first wave happens as a result of the overthrow of monarchies. The second wave happens for three reasons. One is that the United States and other Western powers imposed democracy on the countries that had lost World War II. So the US imposes democracy on countries like Germany and Italy and Japan. So that's one reason the countries become democratic in the second wave. Second, decolonization started in 1947. And many countries that had formerly been European colonies became independent states. And many of those independent states initially adopted democratic forms of government. And third, in the context of the Cold War between the US and the USSR, the United States supported democracy as a way of extending its sphere of influence. So the third reason that a lot of countries became democratic in the second wave was that they were pushed towards democracy by the United States, who in its waging of the Cold War. And then the third wave starts in the 1970s, and it really gained steam in the 1980s, in a period when many world governments became democratic as a result of internal pressure from their own citizens. So it's a different wave, partly because it happens at a different point in time, but these waves are also distinguished analytically by what causes democratization in each of these waves. So in the third wave, the cause is primarily internal uprisings from pressure from their own citizens. And so this is a period in which many countries in East and Central Europe, Africa, Latin America, and some parts of Asia became democratic. So the iconic examples from this period are countries like Poland and Brazil and South Korea and South Africa. So this brings us to a high point of democracy in about 2004, when just over half the countries in the world were democratic. So liberal democracy peaked in about 2009 and has been sliding ever since. And electoral democracies, so you can see this graph distinguishes between liberal democracies and electoral democracies. Liberal democracies peak in about 2009. Electoral democracies sort of bounced along until they peaked in about 2016, and then they've been consistently sliding since. So it's these last 10 or 15 years of democratic backsliding that we'll be turning to at the end of the lecture. But right now, our focus is on what democracy is and why we value it. So most fundamentally, but also abstractly, as an idea and an aspiration, democracy is rule by the people. It's often defined as a system of government where the people rule either directly, as they did in Athens, or indirectly through elected representatives. And there are three principles that are central to this definition of democracy, and they are political equality, majority rule, and political participation. So political equality is where every citizen has equal standing in the eyes of the law, including equal voting rights. Majority rule is where decisions in a democracy are based on the will of the majority of the people, although it's also tempered by minority rights. And then political participation is the principle of citizens having the right and opportunity to participate in political processes through voting primarily, but also through assembly and other forms of civic engagement. And the reason that these principles mattered historically was a result of where democracy comes from, how it emerges. So democracy, modern democracy, emerged initially as a rejection of monarchies and autocracies, of feudalism and absolute rule. So democracy symbolized a shift toward autonomy and freedom and self-governance and rights, the rights of citizens. And these principles operated as a foundation for creating systems of government that ensure that the public's voice is heard and respected in governing decisions. So, for example, in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Thomas Jefferson famously wrote that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And Abraham Lincoln described democracy as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So, as I said, as an idea and an aspiration, democracy is rule by the people. But in practice, democracy is really a set of institutions that allow people to govern themselves. The democracy as we think about it today is not just at this aspirational level. It's literally the set of institutions that make self-government possible. So these are things like elections. Should we go back? Elections, a constitution, the institutions I'm talking about. So this is still on this slide. The institutions that matter in a democracy, the institutions that constitute a democracy, are things like elections, a constitution, decision-making bodies like parliaments and legislatures, and the rules that function how they govern how they function, an executive branch, the branch of the presidency, a judiciary, which means the court system, and functioning and independent bureaucracies that allocate goods fairly according to agreed upon rules. And then there are other institutions that are not part of government, but are still very important to the proper function of democracy. And those are things like a free press and civil society organizations, including non-governmental organizations and grassroots movements. And these organizations play a very important role in holding democratic governments accountable and ensuring that democratic principles, are upheld. So I would say that a free press and civil society organizations could also be called institutions of government, of democratic government, along with elections, a constitution, parliaments, legislatures, the judiciary, and so forth. So, why do we value democracy? So there are two types of reasons that we might have to value democracy. Democratic theorists distinguish between what they call intrinsic reasons and instrumental reasons. So the Intrinsic reasons are those that are inherent in the thing itself. We value democracy for its own sake, just because it's a good system of government. So in this instance, democracy would be like happiness, for example. We value happiness because happiness itself is good, not because it produces other things that we value, like wealth or better relationships with our families. Happiness itself is the good, it's the thing we're seeking. So peace would be another example, something we value for intrinsic reasons. So some people argue that democracy is basically like peace and happiness. It's good intrinsically, it's good for its own sake. And so what are the things that are intrinsically valuable about democracy? The first is that democracy is the only form of government in which the people govern themselves. So the idea that people should have the right to govern themselves is a core intrinsic reason for valuing democracy. Even if democracy does nothing else, it allows people to govern themselves, and people governing themselves is a good thing. So democracy, this idea is that democracy is a legitimate form of government because its authority derives from the people who are governed by the democracy. So the people authorize the actions of government when they elect leaders who take those actions. It's the democratic procedures of self-governance that are themselves valuable. A second intrinsic reason for valuing democracy is that it is a system of government that rests on the proposition that human beings have rights, and that governments are obliged to respect and even protect and uphold those rights. So these include things like rights to free speech and assembly, and those are democratic rights, rights that don't necessarily exist in other systems of government. And a third reason to value democracy for its own sake is that democracies also enshrine political equality through principles like one man, one vote. And that's an expression of the principle that all citizens have an equal voice in the selection of their leaders and the crafting of laws. And democracy is also tasked with protecting freedom, and it's associated with greater freedoms, including freedom of speech and religion and political expression. The second set of reasons, the second sort of type of reason that we might value democracy are instrumental reasons. And the idea here is that we do not value democracy because of anything inherent in democracy. We value it only to the extent that it delivers good outcomes. So whether or not democracies do lead to good outcomes is sort of an open question. Some people argue that they do, and other people argue that they can lead to good or bad outcomes. And they have also, so they can lead to good or bad outcomes. So some people argue that democracy is value neutral. It has no, there's nothing intrinsically of value to democracy, and that we would only value it if it leads to good outcomes. And there are three main outcomes that people argue that democracies are better at delivering. So some people argue that democracies are better at delivering peace. So it was Immanuel Kant who first argued that democracies are less likely to go to war against each other. And that is called the democratic peace theory. But this has been supported more recently by political scientists like Bruce Russett, who show that historically, over the course of the last 150 years or so, this has actually been true, that democracies tend not to go to war against one another. A second thing that some people argue democracies are better at producing is economic prosperity. So there are political scientists like Robert Barro and Darren Acemoglu who suggest that democracies are more likely to foster long-term economic growth than other systems of government. And finally, some people argue that democracies are better at producing social justice, so that they're more likely to address income inequality through policies like progressive taxation and social programs than other systems of government. So democracies are more likely than monarchies or authoritarian governments to produce social justice, good social justice outcomes. So now I want to focus a little bit more on the value neutral view that I put on this slide here. So although many people argue that democracy is intrinsically good for the reasons that I've identified, like it includes self-government and human rights and equality and freedom, there are also some people, notably an author named Robert Kaplan, who argue that democracy is value neutral. And what they mean by that is that democracy is neither good nor bad. It's nothing more than a set of institutions that translates the will of the majority, the will of most people in a society, into the government. So if the will of the majority is good, then the outcome will be good. And if the will is bad or wrong, then the outcome will be bad. So these people argue that a democratic government does nothing other than translate the will of the people into leaders and policy. And so those leaders, the people might elect a good leader, or they could elect a bad leader. So historically, for example, both Hitler and Mussolini were brought together through democratic elections. They were both elected to power, and then they used their elected positions to consolidate power, and they became authoritarian dictators who dragged their countries into genocidal and ultimately losing wars. So the argument here is that there's no mechanism inherent in democracy itself that prevents a bad outcome, precisely because democracy reflects the will of the majority of the people, and that majority is as likely to be bad or to make a mistake as it is to be good, to produce good outcomes. And obviously, if you believe that democracy is value neutral, then there are no intrinsic reasons to value democracy. If we value it at all, it would be for instrumental reasons, because it produces good outcomes. And if democracy fails to produce good outcomes, then we have reason to prefer alternative systems of government. So if you think that democracy is value neutral, then really all you want is whatever system of government works best. And so you might say democracy, with all of their participation and their opposition, can be unstable and messy, and it can be easier to govern effectively if you can just focus on getting things done, even if sometimes those things are unpopular. So let me just make this more concrete with an example. Some people argue that democracies, for example, are not good at dealing with climate change. Democracies might not be good at implementing the changes needed to reduce carbon emissions. And there might be two reasons for that. One, because those changes aren't popular among voters and other constituents like oil and gas companies. So the changes are costly. It's expensive to reduce carbon, and many people depend on a fossil fuel economy. So if people don't support reducing carbon emissions, or if wealthy oil and gas companies are your powerful constituents, then politicians aren't going to implement the policies that would get them voted out of office. And the second reason that democracies might be especially bad at reducing carbon emissions is that elected officials have short timelines. They live in a world of short perspectives. So this is less true now that the impacts of climate change are upon us, but for many years, for many decades in fact, climate change was considered a problem that we would have to deal with in the future. And for many people, if they're only in office for 4 years or 2 years or 6 years, they are not going to implement policies that are costly and unpopular today while they're in office for some future benefit that will only come about when they are no longer in office. So this is what some political scientists call a short horizon problem. And so some people argue that democratic governments have short horizons. They can only implement policies that are going to benefit people today, and they can't take the long view of what's good for their countries or what's good for humanity. So to circle back here to this slide, this climate change is an example. This climate change example is an illustration of one specific argument that has been made about the inefficiency of democratic government in successfully addressing one specific issue, the problem of climate change. So if you believe that the value of democracy is instrumental, that we should value democracy only to the extent that it produces good outcomes, then you might argue that what the world needs is more dictatorships that take climate change seriously and that are able to impose the costs of reducing climate emissions because they don't care whether it's popular or not, because they can quash the opposition or they can silence dissent, and they don't have to rely on elections to put them back in power. They can stay in power as long as the military basically supports them. But I'm going to conclude this section with a counter argument. The problem with favoring wise dictators over democratic governments is that dictatorships have no mechanisms. They don't have any rules or institutions or even norms for ensuring that the dictators are wise or that they recognize the dangers of climate change. So the kind of government you have and the kind of policies that your government enacts and the extent to which it respects human rights or eliminates opposition, in a dictatorship, all of this depends on the personality of the dictator. So if you have a dictator that is smart and tolerant and popular and focused on the right things, then you can, I think, get a very good outcome. But there's no way of ensuring that that's the case. There are no mechanisms in place, no institutions in a dictatorship to remove a bad dictator from office. And not only that, but historically, there are not a lot of good examples of good and wise dictators. So the example that most often comes to mind is Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. But the fact that there is only one go-to example of one of these wise and good dictators who mostly had the well-being of his country in mind, the fact that there's only one of them tends to support the position that relying on the personality of your dictator or your autocrat is a risky thing to do. And so I would personally go back to the idea that the reason to value democracy is not necessarily because it produces better outcomes, but actually for the intrinsic reasons. The reason that democracies are good, are valuable even if they don't produce good outcomes, is that they are systems of self-government where authority rests in the people, and they rest on equality and human rights and the protection of certain freedoms, and they include mechanisms to get rid of unpopular or bad leaders. And in a democracy, good governance depends on institutions and norms of behavior rather than personalities. So a democracy isn't just limited to or dependent on the good behavior of your dictator or autocrat in order to get good government.